Our speaker is Mr. Alex Newman. He's from Liberty Centennial Media. He's the CEO, and he'll be presenting today, Spreading Freedom Abroad. Let's give a welcome to Alex Newman from Florida.
Hi, everybody. It's an honor to be here speaking before you, and I'll start with a little bit of an introduction. I guess the reason why I'm giving a talk on spreading freedom abroad, I've had a wonderful opportunity in my life that I've lived a lot of it overseas, probably 15 or 16 years. I've been out of the country. We moved when I was 4 years old, thanks to my dad's job, who's sitting right there. Dow Chemical, they transferred us to Mexico to start with when I was 4 years old. So we'll start there. To talk about spreading freedom and freedom abroad, it's first important to identify what freedom is, in my opinion, because you have a lot of people when they talk about freedom, especially nowadays with the doublespeak, what they really mean is freedom from responsibility. They're talking about, you can be free if you just let the government take care of things for you. And I don't think that's a good definition of freedom, so that's why I have that up there. And then, of course, you have economic freedom versus personal freedom, and if you look around the world, you have varying degrees of some in some countries and some in others. Hong Kong is probably the most economically free place in the world, and Singapore and places like that. But then in Singapore, you also have very little personal freedom. So it's interesting dynamics. And then, of course, you have freedom from want versus freedom from need. In America, there's not very many people that have need for things they don't need food and shelter and this sort of stuff. We're a very blessed country with the free market system. We have enough resources pretty much to take care of everybody pretty well. And my whole life while I was overseas, I was raised with the idea that America is the land of the free and so forth. And just for you guys to think about, is it still the land of the free? I think the principles it was founded on are the best that any country's ever been founded on in the world, but it seems we're moving in a bad direction, in my opinion. So to start with, I lived in Mexico City from when I was 4 till I was 11, and we lived in Mexico City. It was the biggest city in the world at the time, and I had a lot of interesting experiences there. One thing that is immediately apparent, like in a lot of third world countries, is the amount of poverty. The oppression that comes down from the government, it really keeps most people in poverty. There isn't really much thing as a middle class, for example. That there was one starting to bloom, but as I'll talk about in a minute, it kind of got wiped out. I actually got to meet the president of Mexico while I was living there at a sports club. And at the time, everybody thought he was a swell guy. He was wonderful. He was taking care of things and so forth. Everybody thought he was great. And when he left, it turned out he had stolen millions of dollars from the Mexican people, put it in Swiss bank accounts, and now he lives in Ireland. So he wasn't so great. Some of the stuff he was involved in was selling. They had a lot of nationalized industries. They still do. For example, the energy industry. And he sold the right to buy these to people like Carlos Slim, who's now one of the richest people in the world. And that's just one of those scams that the corrupt governments in third world countries use to keep the people poor and help out their cronies. While I was there, also there was a man running for president. His name was Colosio. And he was supposed to be some great guy. Everybody loved him, and everybody thought things were finally going to change. And before the election, he was actually assassinated. And so, that's kind of the stuff that kind of happens in third world countries. We're not used to it as much here, but it's pretty typical in other places. And like here, they have a pretty elite monopoly on politics. They have one party, actually the PRI, the Institutional Revolutionary Party. They actually were in charge for 65 years. Without ever losing the presidency, and finally recently they lost to a candidate from the PAN party. But it's a pretty tight monopoly on politics there, and it's the same good old boy system, the same cronies that stay in the government. And the amount of corruption is just incredible. Two personal stories from when I was living there that I just wanted to talk about for a minute. Our house was robbed while we were living in Mexico. We lived in one of the nicer neighborhoods. And, so it got broken into. One weekend we were away. We came back. We found knives on our beds. All our drawers had been opened and ransacked. Everything was taken. And instead of calling the police like you would do in the United States, our lawyer said, no, don't call the police because they'll come in, they'll see if there's anything left in the house, and then if there is, they'll come and take it. So that's not what you do. We did have private security that roamed the neighborhood, but who knows how effective they were. They didn't stop the house from getting robbed. So. But and another interesting story, when my brother and I were on our way to school one day with our mother, and we had a Florida plate on our car, a Florida license tag, so that's, immediate warning signal to the cops, oh, there's some stupid Americans, let's go try to rip them off. So we got pulled over. They said that my mom had run a red light. I don't even know if she did or not, probably not. But so we got pulled over, and they took my mom aside, and the cop came to our car, and, oh, don't worry, I'm your amigo, no problem here, I just need to talk to your mom for a minute. And he told my mom that he was basically going to take her to jail and leave us there on the side of the road unless she forked over what they call a mordida. It's a bribe. And it's extremely common. It happened on more than one occasion. You have to bribe the police to pretty much live there. But let's see. One crazy thing that happened there, Americans have some experience with inflation, but nothing like this. Back then, 1,000 pesos would buy you, a little piece of candy or something like that, and it all was well. And then overnight, it went from 1,000 pesos to being 3,000 pesos for the same thing. And over the course of a little while, it went from 3,000 pesos to $1 to 10,000 pesos to $1, just extremely rapidly. And what that did for the economy was just horrible. It pretty much wiped out the little bit of a middle class that was developing. Wages obviously didn't keep up with inflation, so people were getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And actually some statistics up there. In 1995, inflation was 54%, and the wages rose at 24%. So, of course, the rich, the cronies, and all the people who were friends of the government and the central bankers and so forth, they knew this was coming, so they put their money in the United States in dollars, in banks in Texas and so forth. And then when it happened, right back to Mexico, and you pretty much make a ton of money, while the poor people just get poorer. So, that's the type of stuff that happens. Also, mortgages rates went from 20% interest to 100% interest. So, again, with the little bit of a middle class that was starting to develop there, got completely wiped out. Nobody could afford their mortgages anymore, so they just took their keys back to the bank, and that was that. And, one saying that's actually popular in Mexico, it's pretty well known. All Mexico needs for a revolution is a leader. And I suspect that that's probably true. People are very sick of the system, but they're so poor and they're so uneducated that they don't really know what to do about it. And so you have a pretty miserable situation there for the most part. And, Mexico is one close neighbor that lacks freedom, and I guess we experience that through illegal immigration, people trying to find better economic conditions and living conditions, sneaking across the border. They're willing to risk their lives to get out of there to come here, so it's a pretty good indication of what it's like. After living in Mexico, we moved to Brazil, Sao Paulo. It was the second biggest city in the world at the time, and that was a shocker. The first thing I remember when we got off the plane and we got out of the airport was just these massive housing, they call them favelas in Brazil. It's hard to explain it to somebody who's never seen it. It's little houses made of, corrugated metal, and sometimes they have car doors as the entrance to their house. They sleep on the dirt. Sometimes you find illegal satellite dishes hooked up, but it's pretty miserable down there. It's a lot more independent than the U.S. in terms of the economy, probably because of the distance, and the distribution of wealth is even more extreme than it is in Mexico. The amount of poor people is huge, and the amount of rich people is pretty small, and they pretty much run everything from the government to the media to everything. They have another interesting thing that you notice right when you leave the airport is they have a river. It's the Tietê River, and then there's one other one with roads alongside of them, and they're so polluted, it's incredible. There's a joke that you can walk across them, but it's hard to explain. It's just raw sewage, industrial waste, everything right in the river, and it's pretty bad. I think they're starting a project now to clean it up, but it's probably more corruption and more stealing of money and very little actually getting done. And it's funny. People don't actually stop at red lights at night oftentimes because they're so scared of getting carjacked or shot that they just honk the horn and drive right through the red light. It's definitely different from here. And we had a similar thing with the devaluation there. The real went from it used to be pegged. The government had just made a decree that 1 real would be worth $1. And of course, that's not sustainable. So it just went like that to 3 to 1. And the same thing that happened in Mexico, the poor people suffer, the rich people benefit because they knew about it in advance. And so you get a perpetuation of the system, and it becomes even more dramatic. And while we were there, we also experienced Argentina had an economic crisis at that time, and people started flooding across the border. Their economy was in shambles. Inflation was out of control. And that relates back to the central banks, which we have one here. It isn't quite as out of control as it is in other countries where they can get away with it, where the populace is more uneducated and so forth. And the taxes on businesses are sometimes so oppressive that they just have to cheat just to be able to survive and just to be able to keep their business running, hide their income and so forth. And that's pretty sad to see. Whereas the rich people, they find ways of avoiding taxes, of course. That's a picture of a pretty nice favela, just to give you guys an idea of kind of what it looks like. See, those ones actually have bricks and everything. So, I don't know if any of you all have seen the movie City of God. It's a Brazilian movie. It's in Portuguese, but it deals with the favelas and the crime. And it's a good portrait if you want to get an idea of what Brazil and what these poor areas are like. And this is how the great majority of the population lives. Actually, our house, we lived in a building where we were behind armed guards, and we had electric fence all over the place. And in Mexico, it was the same thing. After we got robbed, we put up electric fences. My father went out and bought a gun on the black market because you couldn't go to a gun store. You pretty much have to fend for yourself there. So, and then after Brazil, we moved to Switzerland, which was a complete 180-degree turn. Probably, if not the richest country in the world per capita, right up there. And it was a beautiful place. It's a great country. And the system of government is organized sort of how the United States is supposed to be organized. It's actually a confederacy, but they have a very weak federal government, and the cantons is where most of the day-to-day decisions are made. They have, cantonal police, the militia is controlled by the cantons and so forth, with some direction from the central government. But yeah, they do have the compulsory militia service, which we don't have here in the United States at the moment. We have the selective service, but no draft right now. But in Switzerland, as soon as you turn 18, you're required to be in the militia. So that's a little bit different from here. And there is kind of a big brother mentality. Everybody looks over everybody's shoulder and so forth. But I think, in a way, Switzerland is a little bit more free than the United States in some ways that I'll discuss in a little bit. There isn't really a such thing as gun control in Switzerland. It's kind of a laughable idea. When you get out of the militia, you have the opportunity to buy your automatic rifle, which we're not allowed to possess here, for about 50 francs, about $50. And so, it's pretty much assumed that there's an automatic weapon and probably a pistol in every household. You have almost no gun crime. So the people who try to make the argument that more guns is more crime, it just looks absurd when you go to Switzerland and you see the grocery store. People have their machine guns slung over their shoulders, and no one's shooting anybody. So, yeah, but there is some interesting things about their justice system. The Swiss people don't seem to mind. I think in America there would probably be an outrage if this sort of stuff happened. But there was an incident there. A man walked into one of the cantonal councils and gunned down some of the people. And in the newspapers, it reported that he was mysteriously killed or died on the way to the police station. And that was that. There wasn't any more questions, investigations, nothing. It was just, he just died. So no trial, no jury, nothing. But they are starting to have a problem now with immigrants like the United States. Actually, there it's even more exacerbated because they have kind of a tight, controlled system on how you can work. You have to have the permit to be able to get a job. And it's easier to get around it in the United States. But there, the immigrants, when they come in, they're not allowed to work. They have to live off of about $13 or $14 a day that's provided to them by the government in little houses. And I guess the assumption is that someday their countries will be better and they can go back. But a lot of them turn to crime, and so they're starting to get a problem with that. And a lot of the Swiss people are starting to get upset. There's been protests, and they're asking the immigrants kindly to leave. And so we'll see what happens with that. And yeah, in Switzerland you have, for the most part, everybody is middle class. There is the class of really rich people. Some of them come from the United States. I don't know if you guys heard of Mark Rich. He got a pardon from Bill Clinton after escaping with a lot of money that he supposedly owed the government. He lives over there now. But the vast majority of people are middle class, and they live very well. The standard of living there is extremely high. Just to give you guys an idea, I was making about $22 an hour washing dishes in a cafeteria. So that seems pretty out of whack here compared to America, but the cost of living is a little bit higher, but people live very nicely there. And another interesting thing about Switzerland is they don't really have what we know as a war on drugs. If you walk around downtown, you'll see stores where they sell marijuana and magic mushrooms and all kinds of pills and this sort of stuff. And actually, at one point, the Swiss government was giving away heroin to heroin addicts, and they gave them a little park. So it's a different philosophy over there. And in my opinion, it leads to less crime. You don't have nearly the overcrowding of jails. You don't have people shooting each other in the streets and the violence and the gangs that are associated with all this. They eventually stopped the giving out free heroin program. That ended up not working so good, I guess. But yeah, you also don't have these huge bureaucracies that the taxpayers have to pay for, and the availability of it keeps the prices lower, so that in theory you have less, people robbing car radios to afford their drugs and so forth. And yeah, one saying that they have there is that there's a policeman in every Swiss. Maybe that's a good thing. You don't have to have as many police. It's less government. People really do tend to look out for what each other are doing, and if somebody sees somebody doing something they're not supposed to do, they'll go tell them or tell on them. And it's not like America where people say, that's not my problem. And yes, as I said, Switzerland is very strong financially. They hide the world's money for better or for worse. A lot of people who aren't such savory characters hide their money there, dictators and terrorists and so forth. And a lot of people avoid their country's tax laws. But it benefits the Swiss, so they probably have something going there. And another interesting thing about Switzerland is their philosophy of neutrality. They haven't had a war in the last 500 years, and that's because they never get involved with sides. They don't pick and choose, and they don't go fight. They just mind their own business and hide the people's money who are fighting. And it works out well for them, And their public school system is a lot different from ours, and a lot of people call it inhumane. It's a kind of a strange concept to us. When you're in fourth grade, you take they call it a placement test. And the philosophy behind it is then you don't waste resources educating people that, on their test come out that you're going to be a garbage man or something along those lines. And it's pretty much final. There is a way to get out of it, but after you take that test, that's pretty much your career path. And they have 3 different levels of school. They have the one where you go until you're 16, and then you study some kind of trade. Then there's the high school degree where you learn something a little bit more complicated, and then there's those who go on to university. And the Swiss do have very good universities. And yeah, like I said earlier, in Switzerland, it's an extremely free country, in my opinion. Their taxes are low. They have a great healthcare system not run by the government, as opposed to a lot of countries in Europe and what we're moving towards in the United States. And it works out well. They're prosperous. They're happy. Not a big, huge government that they have to support. And in addition to that, they don't like to get involved in other countries' politics. I think they recently joined the UN in some capacity, but that was in 2002, I believe, and they've tried to keep away from all these institutions. They're not officially part of the EU. They signed some of the treaties there, but they're not part of the EU. They're not part of an official part, at least, of the United Nations. And after Switzerland, my father retired. They came back to Florida, and on my 18th birthday, I went to South Africa, to Cape Town. And like Mexico and Brazil, another third world country, there's a lot of poverty down there. And I arrived 10 years after the fall of the apartheid, so it was an interesting experience. I was actually there during the 10th anniversary of the fall of apartheid, and it was all over the televisions, and people seem happy. The older generations are still having a little bit of trouble getting accustomed to it. There's still a lot of distrust between them, but as far as the younger people go, it's not so much like that. They go out together and they shop together, and the distrust is kind of starting to fade. But there is still a lot of racial inequality, as you could call it. The police tend to leave white people alone for the most part, and that's generally acknowledged. And the vast majority of poor people are black, or they also have colored, who are from India and those types of places. They have a very high rate of unemployment as well. A lot of their smarter people are starting to leave the country. The crime rate is getting very, very bad, and so the smarter, educated people want to get out as quickly as possible and move to Europe or the United States, and they call it a brain drain, I guess, and it's not good for business or for the economy as a whole. And AIDS is running rampant. It's just getting out of control. It's not as bad as in other parts of Africa, but to give you guys an idea of the ignorance, there was actually a president in South Africa who went on television and proposed that you could get rid of AIDS by having sex with babies. So it's there's a lot of uneducated people and a lot of ignorance still around the world. And in America, that sounds preposterous, but people did it, believe it or not. And yeah, you can also, this is what I've heard people pointed out, that when there's cops sitting out in front of some of these houses in some of these lower class neighborhoods, they say that those are drug houses. The police actually sit outside and take a cut in exchange for protecting the crack house or whatever it may be from other criminals or other law enforcement agencies and so forth. So you have an extreme amount of corruption there, like in a lot of third world countries. And that's what happens, you know. I did a study abroad course in Chambéry, France, up in the Swiss and French Alps, and the standard of living is lower in France than it is in the U.S. Probably has a lot to do with their socialist policies and their big government. And it's funny the attitude that people take there when they want something. For example, if they want to work less hours, they go out into the street and protest as opposed to talking with their boss. It's just assumed that that's the government's job to tell the employers how many hours employees should work and how much they should be paid. And it's a different mentality, that's for sure. And I actually talked to some police there, and they thought that here in America we're absurd for letting citizens have guns. And it's definitely a different attitude there. I got sick while I was in France, and I couldn't get a doctor's appointment for a few weeks. And by the time I finally could get an appointment, I was already better. So that's what we have in store for us if we keep going forward with the socialist healthcare programs. And they're also getting an immigrant problem. They have a lot of immigrants. They tend to form their own little communities, and it's starting to lead to problems. A lot of them don't want to learn the language, and some of them turn to crime. And so they're experiencing some of the same problems that we have here in the United States. And just to touch on a few other countries that I've spent some time in or that I've just looked at, England, I spent a little while there. It's really becoming a big brother society. They say that the average person in London is on a security camera 210 times per day or so. And so they even have talking security cameras now. If you throw a piece of trash on the floor, they'll holler at you through a speaker, "Could you please put the rubbish in the bin?" And yeah, in England, of course, everybody is a subject of the Queen. So they're not free individuals as the American ideal would go, but they're subject to the crown. And now they're starting to get a pretty large Muslim population, and it's becoming a problem. A lot of English people are upset with it. And the JBS actually had an article up on their website the other day about that some of the Muslims are now being allowed to have their own Sharia court system for matters like divorce and these types of things. So that's very strange what's happening there. And Holland is another interesting country to look at, too, because they're very liberal in some ways, and they have a lot of freedom in some ways, but at the same time they have a pretty big government and a big brother type mentality where the government is supposed to take care of things. But their healthcare system, as I wrote about in my most recent article for the New American, it's orienting more now towards the free market. The government still provides subsidies to make up for the people that are under a certain income level, but it's all provided by private insurance carriers and private doctors and so forth. Sweden, where my fiancée is from, she's also sitting here. It's known as the land of socialism, the welfare. And they also have a lower standard of living than here in the United States, at least at the moment. And one interesting thing that I thought from Sweden that I'd bring up is the prosecution of a Pentecostal minister who was reading verses from the Bible regarding homosexuality. He was actually imprisoned for 3 months for just saying what was in the Bible. They call it a hate crime. And this is becoming more widespread throughout Europe, and it's even moving here to the United States, unfortunately. And Colombia is a pretty poor country, and it's also had a lot of problems with government, the same type of corruption that you see in a lot of third world nations. The rich run everything and control the government and use it for their own benefit. And yeah, and the American drug war is actually having a lot of negative impacts on their country. I wrote extensive essay about this for one of my school projects. You have American planes that go there and spray their crops, whatever it may be, and so those people end up destitute, and then they go join the communist militias or whatever it is, the FARC and so forth, and then we have to fund the paramilitary people on the right side to go attack them, and you just end up with an incredible war that enriches U.S. defense contractors and corrupt government officials in Colombia. Paraguay has had the same party in charge for 60 years, like in Mexico. They have the same type of politics, and just now finally the former Catholic bishop became president, so we'll see if that'll make any difference. He was from a different party. It's the first one in 60 years. And Zimbabwe in Africa is one of the most tragic examples of government policies gone mad. Maybe you guys are familiar with Robert Mugabe. He seized all the land from the white farmers and donated it to his cronies, and so the country is now starving. And on another interesting note, their inflation is going so fast that the company that was giving them the paper to print money on has decided to stop doing that. No more paper for them because their money's not worth anything. They can't pay even for the paper to print it on. Chile is probably the most advanced country in Latin America. They have a lot of weird stuff that was going on. The communists tried to take over, and then Pinochet came and supposedly got rid of them. And a lot of people don't like Pinochet. They say he was a dictator, and you know, that's certainly up for debate. I know some Chileans that think Pinochet was a great guy. He avoided the communist threat with minimal bloodshed and so forth. And their police motto is con razón o con fuerza, which means either with reason or with force. So that's strange. And, of course, then you have Venezuela and Hugo Chavez. He's been in the news a lot recently. Pretty much nationalizing a lot of the industries and turning the country into a socialist utopia. And I have a friend in Florida. He's actually a refugee from Venezuela. His parents' businesses were seized by Hugo Chavez and his corrupt administration, and they had to flee the country. You know, honest business people lose everything to some crazy guy, and then at least they were able to move to America and try to make a better life for themselves. They're refugees now, and if the situation ever gets better, they can hopefully go back, but they lost everything. So it's a shame to see that. And, of course, then you have countries like Cuba and North Korea, like Zimbabwe, the extreme example of too much government. What happens is grinding poverty. I'm sure some of you have seen pictures of Cuba. Their cars are from the 50s. They can't even get parts anymore because of the embargo, but just miserable poverty. And the Middle East also, which has been in the news a lot lately, it's especially repressive for women, I guess, as you guys know. Like if a woman is raped, they stone her to death in a lot of countries, and so that's really strange compared to what we think of in America, that's for sure. And in conclusion, I think most of the world is really unhappy with the United States right now, which is unfortunate because the principles of liberty are enshrined here in our founding documents, and they still live within organizations like the John Birch Society and I think there is an opportunity to spread those ideals abroad, but the unpopularity of our country and of our people is going to have a negative impact on that, I think. And I think the U.S. is losing freedom partly because of the unwillingness of people to take personal responsibility, and partly because of ignorance and the government education and so forth. And, you know, terrorist threats are also being used constantly to infringe on our freedoms, and Patriot Act and so forth. And, of course, the Federal Reserve, which, like other central banks, is a huge problem, printing money out of nothing and as debt and pretty much enslaving the country to a corrupt monetary system. And in America, it's not as bad as in other countries, but it's the same type of system, and you can see what happens, what the obvious result is. It's a lot of inflation and worse economic conditions for the people and eventually the elimination of the middle class. And so why is it important for us to spread freedom abroad? There's a lot of reasons, and one is that we could raise the standard of living of third world nations, and that is a benefit unto of itself, in my opinion. It would be good if other people could enjoy the prosperity and the freedom that we have here in the United States still, and it would ideally lead to a more peaceful world, we could hope. It would also lead to more trading partners for the U.S. and an opportunity to import and export more products, which would raise the standard of living here. If they can produce something more efficiently abroad, it would make sense that we would import it and raise our standard of living, and we could focus our productive energies on something even better. that we could then export and bring more money here. It would also lessen the immigration pressure on the U.S. because right now there isn't very much freedom left around the world, and a lot of people see the United States as their last hope to experience that, so they risk everything trying to come here. We end up getting people jumping the border fences and so forth. And I think if we could spread freedom abroad, it would lessen that pressure a little bit. And it would also help to preserve the environment, spreading the ideals of private property instead of government mismanagement of land. And it's a problem that truly is global. If the rest of the world destroys the environment, we suffer the consequences as well. And I think spreading the ideals of liberty would help to preserve the environment. I have an article coming up in the New American, a book review of a book about how liberals have destroyed the environment. It's called The Inconvenient Truths that liberals don't want you to know about because the environmental disasters that they don't want you to know about because they helped cause them. And the author makes an excellent case for why our notions of liberty and private property are the best way to take care of the environment. And so how can and should America help to spread freedom abroad? I started off with a few how we shouldn't. And of course this is all my opinion, and I would love to have a discussion after this about what you all think as well. I don't think it should be through foreign aid. First of all, it usually just ends up in the hands of dictators who use that money to oppress the people further. So it actually has the opposite effect of what the American people are told it will do. And second of all, it's unconstitutional. There's no authority for Congress to be taking money from us and redistributing it around the world to dictators. Just doesn't make any sense, even though the politicians like to say that it will. Also, not through the United Nations, which is a corrupt organization, doesn't recognize unalienable rights. I think that's one of the primary challenges, is to try to overcome the United Nations and their propaganda and their brainwashing. They have so much resources, and their principles are pretty much the opposite of what America is founded on. Their Declaration of Human Rights is more like a declaration of privileges, and it assumes that all privileges stem from the state and anything can be limited by law. And I don't think their aspirations are in the interest of us or in the interest of liberty. And another way that we shouldn't spread freedom, in my opinion, is through war. I don't think we're going to have a very successful trip trying to spread freedom using war. It stirs up resentment against us. It stirs up resentment against our philosophies and our way of life. And it just makes people all around hostile to the United States. And of course, the Founding Fathers advised against it. Madison said that America should not go abroad seeking monsters to destroy. Washington said we should avoid entangling alliances. We should trade with everyone, but we don't need to be invading their countries and so forth. If they want liberty, they should struggle and achieve it like the American people did. And that's okay. I lost the PowerPoint screen, but that's okay. The next slide, I was going to ask you all what your opinions are. What do you guys think in terms of spreading freedom abroad? How can we do that? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's an excellent idea, and I think a lot of the articles, if we could get them translated into other languages, get those ideas out into the world marketplace of ideas. Yes, sir.
I think we do it the same way that the Founding Fathers did, by creating an example that people want to emulate, as opposed to having to say, we can destroy this nation here domestically, then the other people will see that, and then they'll say, this works. That's the best way to do it. We've got to get our house in order first.
Yeah.
Before we can even learn about exporting freedom really abroad, because we're not free. When we recognize that as people that we're not free and we're in full freedom, that fire will burn.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I think that's the most important thing we could do is preserve liberty here in America. I think it's the last best hope for the world. Freedom, and if America goes down and our principles go down, I think that might very well be the next dark ages.
Well, when we got the video, the DVD fell into our hands, the real face of the EU, and we found that there were groups. There's a group organized in Great Britain, opposing that organization over there. And it was very useful. It's been very useful to us in passing our resolution to stop the SPT and all the other, the NAU and so forth. But in order to get permission to use that, we had to contact them. So we used the internet. And headquarters was able to make contact with those people. And now they know that we're here and we're fighting against something similar to what they're fighting against. And in researching what's taking place in Canada, you find that there are groups, core groups in a lot of these countries. Up in Canada, they have a group that is totally against the merger of Canada, Mexico, and the United States. And so I think the internet is just a great tool. I was just on there looking at their legislative website, trying to find out just how far it's gone in Canada and what they're talking about, and I came across this other organization. So, they're out there. There are freedom-loving people all over the world. And when they're trying to regionalize and globalize us, I think we do need to communicate with each other and share what we've learned and do what we can to help. It's going to benefit all of us.
Yeah, I think the internet is definitely one of the most powerful tools available to us to at least spread the ideas to other countries. In some countries like China, you have censorship of the internet, but it is a powerful tool. Just to give you guys an example, I started a Facebook group after some of the school shootings had happened that college students should be allowed to carry their firearms on campus, and that landed me an interview with one of the biggest newspapers in Portugal, and so I had the opportunity to explain to the Portuguese people why it's a good idea. Whereas in Portugal, everyone thought that was a ridiculous idea, out of the question. Just through the internet, they found something I had written in a little group I had started on the internet, and that got me an interview, and so I got to explain the other side of the story.
Well, I think one thing that's important is that our Constitution should really be for all people, because it tells government what they can do and lays out what they can't do, and the rest is up to free people. Of course, establishing a culture of freedom is where it's a real challenge, because they're used to being lazy and taken care of. But it still is a sense of individual responsibility. It all boils down to that. But our Constitution is designed for all people, really, but for them to accept it.
As one who has the privilege of traveling quite a bit, I would say to the people in this room that the first step for us is to be careful of our prejudices, that because people look differently, live differently, we need to set that aside. Something that I've done is try to make a friend in each of the countries I visited, and Zimbabwe is an interesting thing because I did make a friend 2 years ago when I was there. And he and I have exchanged emails through all the turmoil he's going through. We opened a bakery together. The government confiscated his flour, burned it, and in the last 3 months he's now got 8 families living with him. And the government burned their houses and burned their clothes. Well, this isn't just something abstract to read on the internet. You're there, you can meet people, and then you can live with them. And rather than sending money to a nonprofit, I send money directly to John, and he helps those people directly.
Yeah, that's excellent.
I think we also have to remember that freedom really beats the heart of individuals. We weren't really created to be subject to the state per se. And if we return back to the principles that our nation was expounded on, we follow those principles, it's a natural thing that people will want to avoid us because it has happened for 200 years. People will want to come here. If we return back to this, people are going to see that and have hope that it can't happen for them.
Yes, sir.
A lot of countries copied our form of government, like in Latin America, you see Congress with both houses and the president. Has any country ever copied our Constitution, the Bill of Rights, or we're the only one?
Philippines twice.
Pardon? No, I mean, is there a Constitution similar to ours?
The Philippines have
In other countries?
Yeah, apparently the Philippines had one, but other than that, I don't know of any.
Where?
The Philippines?
Philippines. They use the same constitution.
Yeah. But yeah, I think if we would go back to following it, people would see the amount of prosperity that comes from here, the amount of happiness and just living free, and that would give people the inspiration to try to do that in their own countries. Yes, sir.
What was the name of your organization and what is its purpose?
Liberty Sentinel Media Inc. We've actually been printing a monthly newspaper for about the last year or so. So it's just about freedom and that sort of stuff, political newspaper. I have a few copies if somebody wants one. I can get one out of the car later.
Yeah, I'd like to see one. Sure.
Yes. Do you know what McCain has been doing in his recent trips to Latin America?
No, I'm not familiar with that. No. Do you? No.
What did you ask?
If what McCain has been doing on his recent trips to Latin America.
Well, just one last comment on spreading our form of government to other countries. Those who have attempted to do that, like Moise Chombe and Katanga, and like what happened with Chiang Kai-shek, because the people's minds weren't prepared for the freedom message, they ended up ousted and genocide took place and those sorts of things. So really, I think our literature material just needs to be translated into other languages and made available.
Yeah, I spoke with some of the people at headquarters about getting some of their stuff translated because I think it's valuable for everybody.
Exactly.
Yes, ma'am.
Just to add to hers before my question, our Constitution was made it's a biblical Christian document for a Christian country. So I think in order to be prepared for the freedom message, they would have to be Christianized, so to speak, more or less, because that's what it is. What it is. My question was regarding Iran. Within the last year, one of the cable networks interviewed the Shah, the son of the former Shah of Iran, who is one of many that have freedom movements. There's a great underground anti-government freedom movement, many organizations in that country. And they asked him, what would be his recommendation, to free his country. Definitely, don't send troops, he said. We don't want the military coming in here. And don't, give us foreign aid, He said there are freedom movements, that if we could be enabled somehow. And he said, asked him, what kind of a government would you initiate? He said, we would like a constitutional republic as like you have. So apparently, I don't know about the other groups, there may be agent provocateur groups among them, but the Shah son is very much in tune with the freedom movement, and I think he lives in San Francisco, the Bay Area, and he's heading up, and there's a following of the Shah in exile. How do we, without being interventionists or whatever, enable that freedom movement? I mean, is there a way to do that without, military and fight with the government? I mean, how can we help them at this particular point?
Yeah, that's a tough one. In my opinion, our ideas are sound. The problem is that the government has an interest in perpetuating itself, and so it's quite a challenge to try to deal with that. But hopefully the ideas can eventually make it over there, and I know there's a lot of people in Iran that are interested in living under freedom. So we'll hope that can happen. Do we have time for one more question? Yes, sir?
Yeah, go along with what you were saying about foreign aid. If we could just get our government to quit giving foreign aid, then the dictators wouldn't have as much capacity to subvert people all over the world through their movement.
Yeah.